Have you ever found yourself distanced from someone that you love and that you want to minister to, but for some reason your paths have been separated? That's the situation that Paul found himself in when it came to the Thessalonian Church. I'm sitting here at the port of Thessaloniki, which is traditionally called Thessalonica. Paul had come here directly after being at Philippi, and he went through a few other cities on his way, but this was his next major stop on his second missionary journey. When Paul got here, he preached in the synagogue for 3 days, and he had a pretty good reception until some of the Jews were moved with jealousy, and they decided to come against Paul. They took some people from potentially the marketplace and came and attacked the house of Jason, but they didn't find Paul and his companions, so they took Jason and they brought him and some of the other believers before the leaders of the city, and they told them, "This man has been welcoming those people that have been turning the world upside down, because they have been teaching that there's another king named Jesus that people should be following rather than Caesar." And so the leaders of the city and the people were moved with concern, and they took a certain amount of money from Jason as security. When Jason was let go, the followers of Christ sent Paul and Silas and Timothy away by night to the city of Berea. But unfortunately there, Paul still didn't get away from those jealous Jews, because once they heard that Paul was preaching in Berea, some of them came and stirred up trouble there. And then Paul moved to Athens. Later on, when Timothy met him there, Paul sent him back to Thessalonica to check on how the church was doing. Paul was very concerned for them. And I want to read you some parts of 1 Thessalonians, because Paul, in his concern, decided to send Timothy to make sure that the church was thriving, that it was growing the way that it should. In chapter 3, he says, "Wherefore, when we could no longer forbear, we thought it good to be left at Athens alone, and sent Timotheus, our brother and minister of God, and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and to comfort you concerning your faith, that no man should be moved by these afflictions. For yourselves know that we are appointed thereunto." So Paul faced affliction in Thessalonica, and so did the church that was established there. And Paul wanted to make sure that they were doing the things that they should be doing. And Timothy came back with a wonderful report saying, "Paul, they're growing in the faith, and Paul, they're growing in love." And Paul is so excited about that, but at the same time, Paul still has this longing to be able to be with them. And so we see that so beautifully in this letter. We see the heart of Paul being poured out as a pastor, as someone who wants to reach those people. And nothing pleases us more than when those people that we love are thriving, but we also are concerned for them because we want them to continue growing. And so Paul actually says here, though, that the report of their faith in Thessalonica had gone so far. It reached not only in the Macedonian area, but it reached all the way down to the lower regions of Greece. And he said, and in every place. Because Thessalonica was one of the largest ports in the time of Paul. And so their testimony, through their affliction, how they held to Christ, was able to reach to so many people. Paul himself alludes that he was in a tough situation where he was when he was writing this. It's believed that he was writing it from Corinth. And Paul came across some tough times in Corinth as well. But Paul says that when he got this news about them, he was so encouraged by it. But then later on he says, in the end of the epistle, "Pray for us." Paul needed prayer just like anyone else. Paul was a normal person with a great God that was leading him to do great things. And sometimes we think that Paul really wasn't affected by the things that happened to him. But that's not necessarily true. We see in Corinth that he did have this time that it seems like he was very depressed, and it seemed like he didn't really want to preach to the Jews. But Jesus came to him and said, "Hey, Paul, don't be afraid. I'm with you." A righteous man, in Proverbs says, a righteous man falls 7 times, but he gets up again every time. That's what made Paul the man that he was. And he was encouraging the Thessalonians to do the same thing, saying, "Guys, it is tough at times, but just like I'm enduring through the tough times, and God's a great God. God's a great God who can do the same thing in you." And at the very end, he closes with some amazing words. He says, "Faithful is he that calleth you, who also will do it." Paul wasn't able to be there in body, but he knew that the same Spirit that was working inside of him was the same Spirit that was able to work inside of the believers here at Thessalonica. And a lot of times we find ourselves in those situations where we wish we could be there to give something, but we know that God is really the one who is there, giving the things that those people need. And then he says this, the third to last verse in his epistle, in the first epistle, he says, "Greet all the brethren with an holy kiss." Now, I always used to think that this verse was meaning, hey, this is how you should be greeting one another. But really, I believe what it's saying here is that Paul's saying, hey, give them a kiss for me. Just like we tell people, say hi to your uncle for me, or hey, give your mom a hug for me. In other words, Paul's saying, hey, listen, I want you to greet these people that mean so much to me with a holy kiss as if I were doing it. Then we get to 2 Thessalonians. Paul hears that there have been problems in the church at Thessalonica and that false teachers have been giving incorrect doctrine. And Paul writes a letter. And in this letter, he alludes that potentially there might have been letters written in his name and in some of the disciples' names that were with him to confuse the church. And so he tells them, again, he lays the foundation of who Christ is and what God is doing, and it confirms their faith. And in the end, he actually says, see, this is Paul. I write it with my own hand. He gives basically his signature, saying, listen, this is how I do this in all my epistles so that you know this is actually from me. And so we really see the heart of Paul, his concern, his love for these people. He couldn't almost even finish the first epistle, it seems, because he just jumps into, hey, remember this, and hey, remember this, almost like a mother who's trying to give last-minute instructions to her kids before a trip. And Paul actually calls himself kind of like a father to them, like his concern for them. So maybe you find yourself concerned for some people. But remember that even though we're not able to be there specifically for them, we can pray for them like Paul did. We can ask them to pray for us, and we can be having fellowship from a distance. But also, Paul knows that God is the great God who, even though Paul's not there to minister himself, God was ministering to their needs. And that's the type of faith that we need to have, to say, God, care for those people the way that only you can.